Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to give a minute or so for late arrivals to attend. I can see that we already have a good number of attendees logged in for this afternoon's event, so that's marvelous. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds and then we can get going. Okay, so I think our attendees list has settled down. I think we're probably expecting a few more people, but if I get started, then people can join us as they see fit. So welcome. My name is Gwyn Tudor, and I'm the Chief Executive of MediWales. MediWales is Life Science Network for Wales, so we're a membership organisation, and our role is to bring together industry, both industry in Wales and industry partners who want to work in Wales, with the clinical community and the research community in Wales. So we do that for about 180 members, and we've been doing it for around 30 years. Not me personally, I've been doing it for about 18, but the organisation has been active for around 30 years. So that being said, we've never had a situation like we've had over the last year. So things have changed a little for us. We're quite accustomed to doing events, doing product demonstrations, having innovation showcases, but we're accustomed to having them all in the same room. But that gives us an opportunity. We are saying hello and welcoming this afternoon guests from across the world, which is something that we wouldn't be able to do if we were in the same room. So I'm very pleased to welcome all of our international delegates, wherever you are and whatever time of day it is. Thank you for making the time to join us today. So one of MediWales's most long-standing and active members is DTR Medical, an Innovia medical company. DTR have been engaged in innovation projects and in collaboration and engaging with our government and our clinical and our research partners in Wales for a very long time. Very active partner in MediWales. So when they asked me if I could play a role in their reaching out to their community to demonstrate a new novel innovative product, I was only too happy to do so. And so I'll be chairing today's event, which is an absolute delight for me. Like everybody else who's registered in time, I've got my product samples ready, and I will be listening along and trying out the products along with the rest of you in the room, and that's all adding to an extra dimension. We've never done that online before, and I'm really pleased that we have the opportunity to do that. So my first role is to introduce our first VIP speaker, to do a bit of an introduction to you, for you, and so I'm going to hand over in a moment to Neil Mercer. Neil is the Vice President of Innovia UK, and Neil, I'm sure that Isabel is now putting your image and you're on screen and turning your microphone on. So so Neil, can you hear us? So you're still muted, and now
hello? Yes,
Neil, that's perfect. Got you. Okay. So wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. Before I start, I'd just like to thank MediWales for hosting the webinar on our behalf, and Gwyn, you for your introduction. This is our first of many webinars which we hope to produce in the future. So thank you for helping us with this one.
Absolutely.
I'd also like to give you a brief introduction to Innovia Medical. As Gwyn just said there, DTR is one of Innovia Medical's companies, and Innovia Medical was created in 2015 to bring together like-minded companies that operated initially in ENT and ophthalmology. However, since then, it's grown into other areas. Since 2015, Innovia has acquired 5 companies, the first of which was Summit Medical in the USA in Minnesota, Shippert Medical, which was originally in Colorado, which is now incorporated into Minnesota, Network Medical in Ripon in North Yorkshire, and then we had Eagle Labs in California in the USA, and at the end of 2019, DTR Medical became part of the Innovia group, which has been a huge success for us as a group, I'm pleased to say. Some of you will be aware of some of the surgery types that we operate in. We're made up of 10 brands that focus on delivering clinical value. And if you just go to the next slide, please. And sorry, the next one after that. You can see there that through our brands, we're able to support clinicians in the following fields. We have aesthetic and reconstructive, which is Tissue Trans, our brand there. ENT, of which we have many ENT brands, which one of which we'll be talking with today. Dermatology, general and vascular. Gynecology, which is another big product of DTR, as many of you will know. Neurosurgery, ophthalmology, which was one of our original surgery specialties that we were involved with, orthopedic, and more recently in 2020, which is not a surprise to many of you, we were involved in PPE. DTR were very focused on preparing or designing a face shield, which kept us very busy in 2020. Of course, the SNAP device is also used within PPE as well. And then we have our final area, which is Sterile Processing, which is our InstraSafe brand. And you can see there on the right-hand side some of the brands which many of you will be familiar with, but that just shows you some of the brands within our group. So on behalf of Innovia, I'd like to thank our team at DTR and, more importantly, Ajith George, Chris Colson and Mark Prince from Endoscope-i to develop the innovative SNAP device, which we'll see in detail today. So today we are here to present to you a webinar on continuing ENT diagnosis throughout COVID-19 safely. So back over to you, Gwyn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Really interesting to know a little bit more background about the company and how rapidly the organisation is growing. It must be exciting times for you at Innovia.
It is. 2020 was a difficult year for many, but thankfully we were able to work on PPE equipment, which we distributed around the world. So we're looking forward to an exciting 2021.
Absolutely, and I know a fair bit about the DTR Medical side of the organisation and your contribution there to the PPE efforts in Wales and the wider UK. So I think an awful lot of clinical colleagues would pass on their appreciation for those efforts that your teams made. So now we hand over to Ajith. I believe Ajith is ready for us, and Ajith is going to give us an overview of Nasendoscopy procedure before we go down into and talk about the product in more specifics. So Ajith, are you ready and waiting for us?
I am, and I'm just about to share my desktop. Hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Camera, hello everyone. Let me just share the desktop here. So there's always a bit of trepidation with all these things as to whether it's going to work or not. But hopefully you can see a PowerPoint presentation on screen. Is that right?
We can.
I know it's gone a bit blank at the minute, but It'll start in a second, hopefully.
There we go. We've got the Endoscope-i logo on screen.
Oh, it's just my computer's being ridiculously slow, isn't it? Here we go. Let's try that again. Fingers crossed. Microsoft working on a Mac.
No problem. We're okay for time, Ajith, so no problem.
Okay, now just let me which screen you can see. Can you see my presenter screen or can you see the actual slides?
You can see a full slide and it says, "What is it? Endoscope-i."
So you can't see the presenter display. That's all I'm making sure of.
No.
Brilliant. Okay. So thanks very much for the introduction. Just to go over things again. So my name's Ajith George. I'm a consultant head and neck surgeon. I work up in Stoke. I work in a team of 4, which is Endoscope-i, which is Simon Pargeter, who's our technical director and the man behind a lot of very clever things that we create amongst the other products in the company. Mark Prince, working alongside Mark on that brains front, who's our engineer, and Chris Colson, who's a consultant skull-based surgeon and ear surgeon in Birmingham. So this was the latest product that we came out with, which is Snap. And what DTR asked me to do is kind of go right from the very beginning as to what exactly is it used for, what is Nasendoscopy. And so just in a couple of slides, just for 10 minutes, I thought I'd run over what this is. So you can see in the image there, there's a patient looking best pleased that they're about to have an endoscope carefully inserted up the nostril. This is in the good old days when we weren't really too worried about wearing PPE for everything. And amazingly, this is how we used to perform this procedure. No gloves, no apron, no eye protection, and just used to basically scope the patient without them wearing anything to cover their face. So often what they would do is cough or sneeze during this process, and we didn't seem to mind. But COVID-19 changed all of that. And the process essentially is passing a fiber optic scope through the nostril in order for us to have a look into the nose, the nasal cavity, into the back of the nose called the postnasal space, and then eventually down into something called the larynx and the pharynx, which is essentially where you swallow and speak from. So here's me in clinic doing the procedure. And one thing from ENT UK in the beginning of the pandemic was that we were advised not to actually look down the eyepiece. You can see I've got a little camera at the end of my endoscope there, but some of us used to actually physically look down the eyepiece to see what we could see at the end of the fibroscope. And since the beginning of the pandemic, in order to distance us away from the procedure, they asked us if we could preferably use monitors and screens, and that's what we've been doing. So hopefully this video will just run through what we're seeing. We're going through the nose into what we call the postnasal space. That's the palate there that's moving when you swallow, and immediately you can see the vocal cords, which is that V there, and this is the larynx. It's a structure that we breathe from, structure that we speak from, as you could hear there. And there's a very complex mechanism involved in protecting our airway, which you can see through that V is the trachea, so it's how air enters into the airway. But when we swallow, that mechanism closes off and opens up the esophagus, which just sits behind that there. So that's what Nasendoscopy is all about. Now, hoarse voices are a common presentation to us in ENT, and actually a problem of a hoarse voice can be one of the main symptoms of laryngeal cancer. And during this whole pandemic, one of the concerns, aside from COVID-19, was the delay in picking up early cancers. And we've been working towards this prior to the pandemic starting, trying to pick up people at a very early rate, because we know the earlier we pick up cancers, the quicker we can treat them and the better their outcomes are. And this table here just gives you a very rough outline of the kind of numbers that we're dealing with month by month. So this is taken from my trust. So if we're looking at June, August, September, October, it just gives you the total in the first column of head and neck 2-week wait referrals. Now, those referrals consist of anything from a lump in the neck, problems with swallowing, or a change in their voice. If you look at column 3, you can actually see out of the, for June, for example, out of the 182 referrals, ENT, divide this up, by the way, with maxillofacial surgeons. So ENT saw 122 of those, and ENT who manage hoarse voices, 70 of those were for hoarse voice. So it makes up anywhere on that graph from sort of 20 to 30 to 40% of our referrals. It's usually the vast majority of the reasons for what we're seeing for 2-week wait early cancer diagnostics. So it's a pretty big problem that we're facing. And the reason why the endoscope is so good is it provides us with an absolutely amazing picture. So you can pick up very small details in the larynx. So here on the right side, you can see there's a small polyp on the vocal cord. And as we see in some of these other images, you can see there's a tumor here of the right side of the larynx, that one not so subtle. And here's something called a vocal cord palsy, where this side is moving on the left. I know it looks like the right to you, but it's actually back to front. Whereas on this side, on the right, that's not working. And that could be indicative of not necessarily a cancer in the voice box, but oddly a cancer in the lung, because the nerve that controls that vocal cord actually goes all the way down into the lung. So just in 10 minutes, it's really just to give you an overview of the importance of performing the Nasendoscopy procedure, why we do it, why it's so important that we continue to do it through the pandemic, so that we can pick up small lesions like this little thing here before it becomes really big tumors like the one in the video there. So I didn't really want to go on to that in any more detail. I'm happy to take any questions. I think there's a Q&A session at the end, but I think I was quite willing then to go on to the next topic on what is SNAP. So I'll just check and make sure you're happy for me to go on to that.
So, Ajith, I think we are. I've posted a message in the chat, just inviting anybody to, if they have any questions, if they can put them in the chat, then we'll try and make a bit of order of them and ask them at the end of the presentation. Anybody who wants to ask any questions or just say hello, then please do it in the chat, and we'll have a bit more of an open forum at the end, if that's okay, Ajith.
Yeah, that's no problem at all. So what I'll do then is I'll just get this shuffled along to the next presentation. See if Keynote fares any better. Let's see if it moves this out of the way. Move this to the bottom. Okay. Can you see the screen now? So it should be a different presentation now, just a nice picture of the SNAP device there.
Absolutely, that's what we've got on screen now.
So now it's just going to go into a bit more detail about the device itself. So what exactly is it? Why have we created, etc. So this is one of the CAD renderings of what the SNAP device looks like. If we just go on here to the next slide. This is what we've come up with. I mean, the reason why we called it SNAP was actually because of the noise it made when we clicked it into place, but we had to come up with a smart acronym. So we came up with this: Safe Nasendoscopic Assisted Procedure. It seems to just roll off the tongue there. When we perform this procedure, as I mentioned before, the scope goes through the nose. And I've got to say, it's very rare for a skilled endoscopist to cause a patient to cough or sneeze during this process. It's the first thing that people get anxious about when they see the scope and you just approach them with this dark black, long 30-centimeter tube that you insist you're going to safely pass through the back of the nose and down inside their throat. Because the first thing they often say is, I've got a strong gag. But the truth is that it's very rare that patients do gag or cough or sneeze during this, if you know what you're doing. But there's always a chance, and it's unpredictable. And we know for a fact that droplets and aerosols are produced if someone coughs or sneezes. And I'm being specific about that because simply the passage of a scope through someone's nose is not generating an aerosol. Nasendoscopy is not an aerosol generating procedure. It is potentially generating an aerosol if a patient coughs or sneezes. The scope itself doesn't have suction associated with it, so it doesn't encourage the passage of air over a mucosalized surface and therefore cannot aerosolize any of the liquid in the nose. I just want to be very clear about that. A nice little animation of what happens with these small droplets, so as they become even smaller, as they disperse into the atmosphere or hit other things, go under 50 microns, I think it is, then technically start becoming aerosolized. And so they can technically spread all around the room. So the logic behind what we were doing was, well, we know that throughout the country, people are being told to wear a mask. And that's not just in hospitals, that's everywhere in a public space, as well as all of the other safe rules of keeping your distance and washing your hands. And when patients come to see us, they all now have a face mask on and completely cover their nose and their mouth. And that's because when they talk, they actually produce a small amount of droplets and aerosols. So by covering your face, you're preventing the distribution of that. So what we decided to do is that if we're going to pass this scope through the nose, we had to create something that maintains the mask covering both the nose and the mouth, which is exactly what the mask manufacturers intended the use of that mask. And so we made a one-way valve. And the idea of that one-way valve was that when the scope passed through the endoscope, through the snap valve, you could easily pass it in. The gel would add a bit of extra seal around that small gap where the scope passes through. You could perform your examination as we've talked about before, and then when you pulled the scope out again, the valve started to shut and everything was sealed away. And we designed this valve in such a way that actually if the patient coughed, it would encourage closure of the valve even more. That's the specific designs that we'll come on to a little bit later. We then had to make sure that this thing was very easy to assemble. It could be something done by the healthcares in clinic. There's plenty of healthcares who work alongside us in clinic. We didn't want to take a pair of scissors to someone's face, which is what we've seen people do when they insist on cutting a hole in someone's mask whilst the patient's there, which is bizarre, but anyway, they feel that's appropriate. So this is positioned approximately a centimetre below the top of the mask, which conveniently has a white band where the aluminium band fits on the mask. So we just ask the healthcares to place it there. There's a outer component, we've color-coded them. It just so happens to be we've color-coded them with DTR's colors. But they nicely fit together. And then we punch a hole through the mask using a trocar, which immediately can be disposed of in the sharps bin, which is present in each of the clinic rooms. And the key thing is that that trocar ensures that the size of the hole is controlled at all times. So if you take a pair of scissors to someone's mask or a blade or whatever you do, I don't think you can guarantee that you've made a hole that's big enough. If your hole's too big, it's just very variable. But this is just one punch through the mask to ensure not only that a hole is created, but also that you clear the mask material from the valve as well. So that's what the trocar does. Now, in terms of positioning this, initially when we were instructing people how to do it, and certainly when I was learning how to do it, and there is a learning process involved in this, we tend to encourage people to use two snap valves. And the reason for that is when one sits at the proximity of each of the nostrils, you get a bit of extra stability. And so it's just a bit easier. It doesn't move around. It's also a lot more intuitive for the patient when they put the mask on because they can clearly see that there's two valves. That must mean that one goes towards each nostril. And the other thing, sometimes when you scope up one side of the nostril, there might be some anatomical reasons why the nose might be narrower on one side than it is on the other. Indeed, with our physiological nasal cycle, we only ever really breathe from one nostril at a time. So it's very natural and normal for us to have one blocked side of our nose and one open side, so it can vary. Many skilled endoscopists actually can navigate through most nostrils, so they tend to just favor a side and can get the scope through. But certainly when you're learning, it's quite useful to be able to have access to both nostrils. So there's a number of advantages to using two snaps, but obviously it means you're doubling up your use. And to be honest, once you get skilled with the procedure and you're skilled as an endoscopist, you can actually just manage with just one. So there's not a problem with just fitting one of them. So there's instructions in terms of how this thing is put on. And we tried to make it as simple as possible. So the first thing is just adjusting the mask. Our patients, when they come to our clinic, actually get given a mask in the waiting area. So they're wearing this out in the waiting area before they even come in to see us, because we just want to make sure that they're maintaining the use of that mask at all times. It's adjusted in a way that it just sits just at the bottom of the nose. And then once the endoscopes in the endoscopy procedure can take place nice and safely. And we've got a specific step-by-step process that I think we'll come on to when we're doing the live demonstrations as to how we use the snap device as the best way of performing this. But the key thing that I think this needs to show is that normally for us, when we're performing nasendoscopy, and we've done as ENT surgeon tens of thousands of these, and we've become very skilled at it, and you can do this pretty much with your eyes closed. However, if I told any endoscopist, just change one thing in your practice, so instead of using your right hand, use your left hand, or instead of scoping using your fingers to control the movable bar on the endoscope, use your thumb, I guarantee they will hate it, because you become so skilled in a process, it becomes autonomous. And suddenly when you have to become conscious of your technical skill, it becomes difficult. And people, especially skilled people like consultants, don't like facing those difficult challenges and certainly being made to look like they can't perform the procedure. And there's no doubt that if you cover someone's face with a mask, all of your visual clues to endoscopy have gone. You can't see the exact point where you'd normally insert the endoscope. You can't see exactly where the nostril is. And so it does make it a challenge. But actually, after a few scopes, you will start to become accustomed to the new way of doing this, because we're all used to performing new skills. But the key thing now is we're now scoping safely with a mask in place. So that's just a little bit of an outline as to what the snap device is and why we're using the device itself. I presume there'll be some questions to take at the end, because what I'm going to do is just move on to the next part, which is just on the creation of the snap. So just give me a second, because I know PowerPoint misbehaves a bit, but it does eventually work. So here we go. So the DTR team and Innovia wanted me to talk a little bit about the process. I happen to have a safe distance in the room with me, Mark, on the other side. I can't say anything too technical because I don't know anything technical to say. And this just gives you a really good demonstration of the challenges that we love to have in endoscope-i. Sometime in March, at the beginning of the whole COVID pandemic hitting the UK, we realized that there was a concern, particularly for ENT surgeons, in performing this examination. And that is purely on the basis that the statement was made that nasendoscopy is an aerosol generating procedure. And I think that's been clarified now, as I mentioned earlier on in the talk. So because of that, there was a complete halt of all ENT examinations in clinic, electively, emergencies, cancers in some cases, all of it stopped because clinicians were worried that they were going to expose themselves to this virus. And we realized very early on that that was just not going to be the way in which we were going to move forward with our emergency and cancer services in particular. So we thought, why can't the patient keep wearing a mask. And I think it was sometime about 11 o'clock at night, I picked up a scrap of paper and drew this very coarse outline of a mask with an outer part and inner part, some kind of valve, which I thought at the time could be some silastic. But the idea of using a trocar to punch through, and there it is. To be fair, I made Mark's job very easy because he had all of the technical details there. I don't know why it took us so long to actually make the device. But you can see there's really not too much difference from the initial idea to where we are now. But actually, that's not true. The truth of it is that we had a number of iterations. And with innovation, it's a very iterative process. And there's probably hundreds more versions of this valve. But these are the landmark steps. And I just want to take you through the creative process of not just making the valve, but the process of making the trocar as well. So initially, the very basic idea was to put an outer part and an inner part. And what we wanted to do was almost shape the inside element of the snap valve to make it look like a Vicks Sinex, so something that was quite intuitive to be quite atraumatic in the nose. The problem that we found with this device in particular, even though it snapped on absolutely brilliantly, and the valve was actually inside it, there was two main problems with it. One was actually the potential expense of creating this, because it's a three-part mechanism, so there's an extra element in it that had to be created and tooled. But the other thing was that you can see here, this thing in total is probably about 2 centimeters long. And what that does is it basically fixates 2 centimeters of your flexible scope, and it reduces the flexibility of your endoscope. So it was actually quite difficult to navigate the scope. Once it was in the nose, around, it fixed it too much. And so that's why we immediately changed those two elements into a two-part mechanism. So just an outer and an inner. The inner now has the valve incorporated here, but you can see we've pretty much halved the height of the snap valve. Now this thing here had almost like a wedge shape inside. So it was pointed at the tip, and it just had one slit. And even though it was much easier to negotiate once the scope was in, it was actually quite difficult to pass the tip of the scope through the wedge. And certainly on withdrawing the scope back, it was actually getting caught. So this one got modified a little bit to the arch that you can see we've kept in the final version here. This almost kind of like arch shape at the tip, and that just allows us for easy entry and easy exit, but also facilitated this idea that when this area was filled with air, it would encourage the closure of the valve. But it was still a bit of a struggle to pass the scope through, because we only had one slit going across here. So what we attempted to do was cross slit. And in the process of 3D printing, which you can see, these are 3D printed, it was actually quite a challenge to create a stable cross slit. So hence the reason why we created these castellations in the inside part of the valve. And that was simply so that Mark would use a microtome here to accurately cross slit the tip of the valve. So that made this sort of crosshair arrangement, and it reduced some of the pressure in getting the scope, it reduced the pressure in getting the scope through the valve. But the only problem was that these castellations are actually quite uncomfortable on the inside of the patient, because you've got sharp edges here. So as you were scoping, this was pushing on the patient's nose, and they were finding it quite uncomfortable as you were passing through. So we had to modify that a little bit here into trying to make this a bit shorter and stubbier. So that's the version we went onto here. We actually had another version that was very short and stubby, but the problem with that was when you made it too flat, we couldn't actually snap the valve on together, so it kept on dropping off the mask. And that was another design challenge, was actually not just the passage of the scope, but it had to be easy to assemble. So the bigger valves are much easier to put on. You don't need very fine finger movements to put a big valve on. But unfortunately, when you got really thin valves, so if we made this too thin, yeah, it looked great, but actually it was very fiddly to click it into place, and also meant that once you pass the scope through, it would be quite easy for the inside element to drop off, which we certainly didn't want. So this was a compromise in height after a lot of testing of different heights of valves. but you can see we've kept with the crosshair arrangement. And we knew that this crosshair arrangement was simply a 3D printing process step rather than something that we were going to keep into the final design. And then we moved on to what you see as the final version now, slightly different color. But the big step here was getting help from DTR because they introduced us into the world of micromolding. And so we were manually cutting this slit because we had no way of 3D printing this very tiny opening of the valve. And fortunately, with the introduction of micromolding, we didn't have to create a slit. And we could actually mold this to a very small point on both of these crosshairs. And what it meant is that the accuracy of these crosshairs each time was identical. And it meant that there were no chances of having any loose ends, particularly at the tip, which unfortunately, in some cases, when we were manually doing it, we were creating almost a tooth defect, which was grasping the scope on removal, which we certainly couldn't have because it would cause damage to the scope. So hence the reason why the micromolding element has taken away the problem that we had with causing damage to the endoscope. So that's just a quick walk through the iterative design process of the valve. So what about the trocar? Well, the trocar just had to do a pretty simple job. It needed to be sharp but blunt, so that, you know, we wanted to be able to stab through, but make sure that it didn't actually cause injury to someone. At the same time, it had to make sure it cleared the mask material inside the valve and wasn't obstructing it. Hence the reason we've created this crosshair effect, because when you twizzle it round, then it will clear some of that mask material. So initially what happened here was we created this first one for the longer valve. We used the same longer trocar for the shorter valves, but the danger was that they were protruding far too much out on the other side and you could actually injure yourself. So that's why we went for a slightly stubbier tip. We then realized that when you've got this very flat disc, you can't twist. So we added an element to it here that enabled it to be easily twisted round so you can clear the mask material, but also meant that it was easy to remove. And this just got modified very much in the process of just making this look a bit nicer. I don't think there was any other design element to that, Mark, was there? Just looked a bit nicer this way. Maybe use a bit less material or something. But the other development here, hopefully you can see between the white and the blue, is that we wanted to make a slightly bigger cut in the mask, because what we were finding was we actually matched this diameter to the largest endoscope, but we realized that the cut needed to be slightly bigger because it was creating a rim of mask that was uncut, that meant that some of the fatter scopes were struggling to get through. So they would get through the valve. We couldn't understand when we were passing it through the valve, the scope was going through no problem, but when we put it in the mask, it was getting stuck, and it was actually because the mask wasn't cut wide enough. So that's the reason why we went for this slightly wider approach, and hence these are the final versions here. This just gives you some of the engineering aspects of the valve, and in particular the valve itself as to how it functions and how it's been designed in such a way that it auto closes. We'll reiterate time and time again that you know, there is obviously a gap here, and people talk about visually seeing a gap, but it encourages closure of this when the patient coughs or sneezes, which is really the only time when we'll worry about droplets coming through. And of course, it's a single-use device, so once the scope's put through and used, ideally you want to dispose of that valve afterwards. So it's not one to be used again and again because you'll deflect the leaflets here. But it just gives you some elements here of the design process in the valve. What I was going to go on to next was a little bit about why we use that, and maybe answer some of the questions as to some of the alternatives that I've certainly seen people come up with, and why we don't think that's the best way of going about things. So this might be preaching already to people who know about face masks much more than we do in endoscope-i, but in this process of learning, we've come across quite a lot about face masks. There are three forms. There is personal protective equipment, and that is protects simply just the wearer. And that's the kind of mask that we use day to day when we're walking around the corridors of the hospital. That's covered by something called the PPE Directive. Then there's face coverings, which is what the government are trying to encourage the general public to use. They're not covered by any particular directive. The material doesn't have to be made of a particular quality. It doesn't have to have a particular filtration rate or breathability or water permeability, etc. It just literally is the common sense hygienic approach of covering your nose and mouth so that if you cough or sneeze, which generates aerosols, then you're just protecting people around you in the supermarkets on their fruit and veg, etc., on everything that they touch. So it's reducing that sort of fomite transmission. But this is the key thing, medical devices. So surgical face masks fit into the medical device directive. And that's because it doesn't just protect the wearer, but it protects the person on the other side. So we wear face masks in particular in theatre. Yes, it protects us from splashes, etc., but it's more to protect the patient from our distribution of droplets and aerosols when we're operating on them, and also to protect the wound site. So medical device, therefore, is covered by the CE mark, and I'm sure many of you will know this again better than I do, but it's good revision for us when we're creating a medical device that it's a logo that's placed on a device by a manufacturer, and it's in order to indicate that their product conforms to the requirements of the still a European directive, and it indicates that the device works in accordance with the intended purpose, and it meets legislation relating to the safety and performance of that device. And then once it bears the CE mark, it can be freely marketed anywhere, currently still within the European Union. So conforming to the medical device directive is key. It's mandated for all medical devices and is certainly mandated for surgical face masks. So if you start tampering with the device in any way, for example, cutting a hole in it or using it against its intended purpose, well, you can do that, but you still, in order to maintain it being a medical device, will still need to justify that modification to the MHRA. And you will need to make that change or modification publicly known, and go through the whole quality management and performance process of the fact that you've modified or changed the way something that the manufacturer has designed or intended it to be used, so it can still conform to a Class 1 medical device. And the government were aware of this during the time of the pandemic, and they created some documentation to support the modification of medical devices to help with COVID-19. But it certainly doesn't excuse you just modifying something just to make something easy and going ahead and using it full steam without a care in the world of what problems that might cause. And this just gives you a bit of an example of an extract of that directive, in particular for a type 2R mask, a surgical face mask, and the British standard that it's got to adhere to. And these are the standards that we've used to validate and test with the SNAP mask in order to ensure that it conforms to the medical device directive. So with a face mask, they use bacterial filtration efficiency, so the BFE greater than 98%. They use splash resistance, up to 120 millimeters of mercury. Now, to test that with a face mask, they use a synthetic blood test for that, and that's because we said that these face masks are generally used in theatre, so synthetic blood seems to be logical to use. But the key thing here, a face mask must fit closely over the nose, the mouth, and the chin of the wearer. The deformable nose bands or nose bridges are recommended, which can enhance the fit and conform to the nose contours. That is how a face mask should be used. And then once you've developed your device, you make sure you go to ongoing risk assessment, incident reporting, post-market surveillance, all in keeping with BS 14683. The post-market surveillance certainly, sorry, this is small writing, but I've literally cut and pasted it from the government documents. But it essentially makes sure that if there's any notifications led to death, led to injury, that you have a reporting process in place. So when we went through testing SNAP, we used that guidance and we tested it in a number of different ways. First of all was its clinical efficiency, safety, testing it with fluorescein, objectively looking at particle reduction, and then looking at the fluid challenge. When we looked at safety and efficiency, it was just making sure that we can still perform the endoscopy, and we can make sure that the endoscopy is performed with no increased coughing or sneezing, no different to how you normally perform the procedure. So we measured the number of times it would take for you to learn that. With fluorescein, we did a very simple test of just testing the valve. So spraying fluorescein through a known lumen size through the valve, making sure that a one-way valve works, and ensuring that nothing leaks out of that aerosol generated out the other side of the valve. And then we had a company, Filtrex, who specialize in room filtration devices, to use an optical particle counter. And an unshielded cough generates about 0.128 milligrams per meter cubed of particles. So what happens if you put a mask on a patient? Well, that reduces it significantly, actually, through the optical particle counter down to 0.04. So that's an untampered mask. And now with SNAP, with it being CE conformed, if you put a controlled known size hole with a one-way valve, the hole itself will create 0.09 milligrams per meter cubed, so a significant reduction from 0.128. And this is still a controlled hole, so not a pair of scissors at the patient. But if you just cut a hole through the mask and leave it as a hole, there's a significant increase in there, 0.043. So it does reduce it, but only by half. So it's or a third, but it's not great. And then in terms of the fluid resistant challenge, we sent our SNAP valves over to Met, who performed the fluid resistance challenges you saw for the type 2R mask, and they created a known protocol. They actually tested us up to 160 millimeters of mercury, so way beyond the test standards. We didn't measure it with blood, we measured it with saline because it would be finer, and also because we don't expect there's any bleeding with Nasendoscopy. So Met designed that protocol specifically to say that would be more suited for testing the valve. So this is just to reiterate the point here of ENT UK, and in particular the fact that this is a potential aerosol generating procedure. The scope is not aerosol generating, and they encourage a patient should wear a face mask during all of the consultation. They aren't specific as to how that patient should particularly wear the mask during nasal endoscopy. I think they tend to skirt around that subject. But the summary of this: SNAP's the only CE marked approved device for nasal endoscopy through a surgical face mask. It's widely recommended that patients wear a face mask whilst they're in the hospital environment, and nasal endoscopy is not excluded from a patient wearing a face mask. So whether people decide to pull the mask down over the chin or cut a hole in it is completely up to them. It's not right, but it's completely up to them. And then this just gives you an example of that skills scoring. It is a new technique, and it takes time for any new technique to develop. And this is just a really, let me just go back to it again. It's a really simple schematic here. And it's basically scoring it from 0 to 6 in terms of, 0 to 5, sorry, in terms of ease. So 5 being performed, the procedure was performed without any hesitation or without any problem. And it scores 1 depending on the number of challenges that you have, the time it took, difficulty of getting it through the valve, etc., etc. And you can see up to the first 30 or so scopes, there's a challenge of getting the scope through the valve. It takes, because it's a new skill, it takes time. But once you get up to that point, it then becomes seamless. And that is just one mechanism that we use to test the performance of the valves and ensure the safety of SNAP. So I'm actually going to stop there now before we run into any more demonstrations. But the next thing really is just moving on to demonstrations of performing endoscopy on different endoscopic equipment and then doing a live demo with a willing volunteer. So I'm just going to pause there.
So Ajith, thank you very much for that. It's a really excellent case study of medical technology innovation. Before we move on to the live demonstration, if you'd like to just to take a breather, maybe answer a couple of questions, just to change the change the pace a little. One of the things I was wondering is the time it's taken you to develop this product. It must be, I mean, you must have done it much faster than would be normal because of the imperative, because of the need through COVID-19. So was there a lot of late nights, or was it all team working and smooth running, or both?
Yeah, thanks very much. So this is what we do as Endoscope-i. We set this company up in 2012 with the idea of taking on these challenges and trying to solve them in a very different way to how we've seen some of these challenges approached in the NHS, which usually no one's short of great ideas, but unfortunately they seem to fail somewhere along the lines because of various challenges in the process. So that really, for us, the challenge of it wasn't too difficult. In terms of the time, you're right, because of the urgency of needing to get this product into the hands of clinicians, we were keen on trying to get it safely certified, tested out as soon as possible, but doing that in absolutely the correct way, because we saw a number of ideas coming through, let's say, that were kind of gaining traction just simply because people were desperate for a solution to keep working. And even though we were keen to come up with something as a solution, we knew that there's a proper way of going about it with CE marking, certification, testing, and certainly working alongside a company like DTR, who are known for bringing medical and surgical products into the market. So we wanted to do it in the right way. So the late nights is kind of how we roll. So they don't really feel like late nights to us, because that's kind of how we function and roll. It's certainly different to design a product from idea to an actual physical product without any of the four of us in the company seeing each other during the whole time. So a lot of that was done on the telephone, online, sending images to and fro, Mark posting out various forms of the 3D printed devices to us, testing it on models, seeing if it would work. And there was a heck of a lot of testing that we had to do, but that's the kind of thing that we really enjoyed, and we had to make sure that at the other end of it that we had as close to a perfect product as we could do. So if anything, probably for us, we felt a bit frustrated as to how long it took. We felt, we probably would have liked to have done it a bit sooner, but we're really pleased to have it out in that short time frame, and also very pleased that Innovate UK set us this target. So we were funded through Innovate UK to create something, and when we went on to an Innovate UK webinar as an update, it was really pleasing to see out of the hundreds of companies that have been given grants, I think we were the only one who actually had a product. Most of them were still talking about what they were going to create, and it's really refreshing to actually say to a company, we'll have a grant, we'll create the product, we've done it, we've tested it, it's out there, it's done. I think that shocked them a little bit, so I think they decided to give us a bit more money to help us on the way. But yeah, it's been a great process, the whole innovation cycle of it.
And do I get the impression that you were working closely with end users, clinicians, and throughout the process as well? So it was a combination of technical skill and clinical expertise working in partnership that meant that you could do the project at this pace.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the advantages of two of us being the end user, both myself and Chris, and I certainly do a heck of a lot of Nasendoscopy. And see, at the time, many units had just stopped. They'd absolutely stopped doing any work, and that was completely unacceptable to do. I'm really pleased that we managed to carry on safely, keep all of our staff safe, whilst other people, I think, were struggling for a solution. So yeah, it's one of the reasons I think within our group that each one of us performs the task that I think is essential to creating medical innovations. So we were our biggest critics as well as our biggest fans.
So no, thank you for that. And I mean, you've come up with a really elegant solution in the end. So congratulations on that. I'm going to ask Isabel now whether or not there are a couple of questions we can take from the chat. But Ajith, when you want to go ahead with the demonstration, well, I'm just trying to break up the presentation a little bit for yourself. So when you want to go ahead with the presentation, we're in your hands. But Izzy, are there one or two questions that we could?
Yeah, we've had a few through, so a few quick ones, and others might have a little more to expand on. So is it possible to use lubricant with the snap adapter?
Lubrication, we'll show in the demonstration when we do it live. The lubricant is absolutely vital. We encourage lubrication anyway with performing Nasendoscopy, but it's key that you use this because not only does it reduce friction through the valve, but it also helps to, that's confusing, isn't it? Seeing me that so many times, this way. But it also actually enhances the seal around the valve when you perform the Nasendoscopy. So we'll demonstrate why that's so important. But I think it might be one of the reasons why people may be struggling a little bit initially and feel a bit fearful about the withdrawal of certain types of scopes, which I've got in the live video demonstration on different types of scope as to how you overcome it. But lubrication's key. Obviously, make sure it's not over the tip of the scope because then you'll be looking through lubricant, which is not going to give you a great view.
Great, thanks. Look forward to seeing more about that. So a few more questions. When we return to the new normal, will you suggest that the snap device and mask continue to be used?
So we've created this absolutely for just restoring clinics. My process now, I'm in clinic no different to how I was in clinic before. So I'm really pleased that maybe we're a few steps ahead of where most other places are, but we see patients normally. I wear a normal surgical face mask. I've not worn an FFP3 mask. This is just normal for me. I guess I don't really see it in any other way. It's just the way that we scope now. Patients really adapt to it. They know they have to wear a mask. There's something really nice about them walking into the room with that procedural mask, performing the procedure, and then when they go, they throw it out into the bin, they wash their hands, and they put a fresh mask on. They really like that. They like that whole process. It seems clean, it seems natural, it seems safe and normal. So it's just good hygiene. When you cough or you sneeze, you cover your mouth. I just really can't see now why it would be sensible to scope someone without covering their face or nose or mouth.
Fantastic. Have you tried using this through a clear visor, then therefore having a clear view of the nostrils?
The visor, as far as I'm aware, on face masks only covers your eyes, so it's not really going to perform any task in scoping through the nose. And also, to hark back to my point about CE devices and masks, they're designed to be worn in a specific way. So if you were to do something like that and modify it, then we'd have to go through the whole CE certification process, testing everything that we've done with SNAP. But the answer to that question is no, we haven't. And if someone wanted to do it, by all means, feel free, but please make sure you go about it in the proper way.
Great, we've got a thought here. Someone would be interested to know how many speech and language therapists have started using the SNAP. I don't know if you might be aware of that at all.
So we have engaged with the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy, and so they're very aware of what we're doing. I think they obviously have their own guidance. They tend to follow a bit what ENT UK do. In terms of whether or not they're using it, I think what they'll tend to do is look within their department protocols, see what the ENT surgeon's doing and follow the ENT surgeons. That tends to be how most of the speech and language therapy units function. I don't think that they'll, off their own bat, start using a SNAP device. We've certainly had a lot of inquiries about it. And I think as time goes on and people start looking for a solution where they can perform an endoscopy exam without having to wear the full level of PPE, because it really is a bit over the top. But I think they'll start coming and asking that question. In terms of how many at the minute, I really don't know. I guess the marketing team at DTR might have a better idea, but I think they sell it specifically into trusts and hospitals as opposed to a particular department, so they might not know on the numbers, but it's certainly perfectly suited actually to speech therapists. Our nurse practitioner who performs nasendoscopy, she uses it. I think what we've seen is people who are learning endoscopy and use this from the start find it very easy, because it's just they learn it from scratch. The challenge is people who have performed thousands of them without using a mask and then having to change, they find it a little bit of a struggle.
And I think our last 2 points are more about the procedure itself and the equipment. So I'll let you go ahead with them, and then if they're not answered in your demonstration, we can come back to them.
Okay, sure. So what I was going to do then is, so very kindly, Carl Stortz and Pentax UK and DP Medical loaned me a whole raft of endoscopy equipment. I've got to say, when it arrived on a big truck yesterday, I didn't fancy carting that all the way down and scoping it all together. So what I've done is I've put together a video, and it's really to demonstrate and highlight the different scoping techniques through SNAP with different endoscopes. So I'm going to share my screen again. It's going to be incredibly confusing.
So what I'm going to talk through is using the SNAP device on a number of different types of endoscopes. These are the kind of classic systems that we'd use in the ENT outpatients for nasendoscopy. This is a Pentax system, chip tip. This one's slightly different, as it has a slightly broader tip to it. So you can see that on the very distal part of it where the CCD sits, it's slightly bulbous at the tip. So there's a different technique for passing this scope through, which we'll show you. This is the Stortz Telepath system, again a digital system, a bit more of a straighter tip here that you can see, so it's not as bulbous but a bit rigid at the end, but certainly protected the Stortz camera at the end there. And then here from DP Medical we have the Zion system. The nice thing about this one is the different action. This one tends to be favoured by a lot of speech and language therapists. The tip of this one again is pretty straight. There's a slight bulge to the tip that we have to be wary about when we're using the SNAP device, and a slight different way of gripping this system. So what we'll demonstrate now is just how you first of all fit the SNAP device. So here on the mannequin, if you look close up, what we've got here is the nostril, and we just place the inside of the SNAP just close to that nostril. You can see that the outer part of the SNAP device just sits underneath this white band here, and it's just positioned comfortably on one side with a gentle grip of the aluminium band here just to secure things in place. So let's just show you now on one of these systems. Let's start with this Stortz system here of how we would scope. So the key thing first of all is to make sure there's plenty of lubrication at the tip of the scope, and make sure there's plenty of lubrication on any parts that might project out. And then this just allows for easy insertion and removal. Make sure your light source is on, your orientation is correct. And for a scope like this, actually passing the scope, there's no real change in your maneuver at all. So first of all is the threading technique, and this is just simply concentrating on passing the scope through the SNAP device. So you can see here, I'm not actually looking at this screen at all here behind me. So once I've threaded through and the SNAP is in, you can see that we've got the inside of the nostril there. I do this adjusting mechanism, which is lifting. And this is just using the index finger here, just to lift up a little bit here. And then this is the nice thing about SNAP, is that it guides the scope in the direction of the nose. And so once we lift, we're really recognising the normal nasal anatomy here, with the turbinate passing through the postnasal space, the eustachian tube, and down to have a look inside the larynx. Again, the beauty of using a SNAP device is that you can scope with one hand. So if you're doing evaluations of swallow, you can actually give the patient something to swallow, and it's quite nice maneuverability just with one hand. Removing this, it's just making sure that your scope is straight. And what I mean by that is that the tip is straight, not bent. This means that it's not hooked when it's coming out of the patient's nose. And you'll note the way that I've always got an index finger here just controlling, withdrawing out this nice straight scope, nice and gentle, but making sure here that the scope is straight, not hooked as it comes out for obvious reasons. So this Stortz scope is a nice scope to use. It's got a very thin channel, but also is quite uniform across this. So let's move to something slightly different now, which is the Xion system. Now the Xion system, as I said, a very thin scope, very light to use, pistol grip, so you can use it in however way you want to. Again, because this is quite narrow, actually, this will work in a similar kind of mechanism before as the Stortz scope. So first of all, what we do is just concentrate on threading it through. You'll feel a give as the scope threads through, and then again, it's just the lifting mechanism to pass the scope into the front of the nose, and then once you're through the nose, it's exactly the same as you were before on the other system, just passing this through nice and gently down into the hypopharynx and then down into the larynx for a beautiful picture there of the larynx. Same again, taking your images exactly how you want to, and the same rule applies when you're withdrawing the scope. Make sure that this bar's in a neutral position so you're not hooking the scope as it comes out. Nice and gentle control on the base of the snap here, and just as you come to the valves, what you want to make sure as you're withdrawing from the valves, and you'll just see them closing on the camera, you see that there's that little give there from the ridge of that scope, but if you've got plenty of lubrication on here and your scope is straight, then that won't cause any bother at all. So that goes in very nicely indeed. And finally, probably the type of scopes that offer the biggest challenge, the ones that have a bigger camera, so it gives you a really nice view, but the problem is that the tip of this scope itself, you can see if we focus on the tip of it, if I just get it right up close to the camera, it's slightly bulbous, and some of these systems are. So let me just give this one a quick wipe down, because I've just got a bit of gel on the tip of it there, just to make sure that the camera is clear. And what we're going to do is pass this in a slightly different way. So when you've got a thicker tip scope like this, what you actually want to do is handle this slightly differently. You need some rigidity here when you're passing the scope through nice and straight. So you hold it in one hand like this, depending if you're left or right-handed. I'm actually right-handed, but I like to scope with my left hand. And then what you do with your other side is you fix the snap just on the patient's nose, and you're just passing this through. So it's the same threading technique. So you thread through, and actually what you can do is lift the snap up into position and just keep threading through until you're just at this part of the nose, which is just normally where we'd start scoping. You can then release back into your neutral position, and then again use the lift technique here to pass the scope through and pass it all the way to the back of the nose. This is the advantage of having slightly bigger cameras, as you know, the bigger the lens, the view's much clearer, and you can see there we've got a beautiful view of the larynx. Now the key thing when you're using these slightly more bulbous tip scopes is on withdrawal of the scope. So the rule applies in terms of keeping the tip straight, so making sure this bar is neutral. This also works for the Olympus scopes, by the way. They are very similar to this. And when you're withdrawing back, you just want to make sure that you've got this good control. So don't just yank the scope out, because it will scrape the end of the endoscope here. But you'll see what I'm doing is always just very gentle, almost like pinching the scope out as it comes out here, and it will just come through these valve leaflets. And actually, because there's plenty of lubrication on there, there's no give at all, there's no resistance at all here to passing through the valves. I can go in and out without any problem at all. And this is what people are concerned about, is whether it catches those four leaflets. But actually, the advantage of it being slightly wider is that it's stretched out the valve a little bit. You can see the valve beginning to close there. So it's a really nice demonstration of the auto-close mechanism of the valve, and as the patient blows, it will seal off even more. And out that scope comes. So that's the slight different challenge with using that scope. So all in all, doesn't really matter what type of endoscope you use, the Olympus one, the Pentax scope as we have here, the Stortz scope, or the Xion scope by DTR Medical. These are the commonest scopes that we see in outpatients. It doesn't really matter which one you use. Snap is very compatible with each one.
Right. That's that one done. Now we have got a proper live demonstration of us using it, and what I'll need is maybe 5 minutes just to set the room up, get a pair of gloves on, get the camera set up so you've all got a good view. Would it be all right if we just, maybe it was time for a break anyway, and we came back in about 5 or 10 minutes or something like that? Would that be okay?
Absolutely, yes. We can break for 5 minutes. Isabel and myself can stay on hand in case there are any questions that we can help answer. But no, Ajith, you do what you need to do to get the demonstration underway, because that was really interesting, and I look forward to seeing the rest of the demonstration.
5 minutes and we'll get set up. Hopefully this tech will work now. There's wires everywhere here, so to do our best. I'll see you in a bit.
Thank you. So we will give Ajith a few minutes to get set up. And now, he did mention that that DTR Medical might be able to answer a few of the questions. So if there is a member of the DTR team who can turn on their camera, Izzy, I think I'm probably putting you on the spot here as well, aren't I? Because you need to promote people to be speakers.
Yeah, if there's anyone in the DTR team who is happy to have a little chat and answer some of the questions, just write it in the chat and I can promote you to be on our panel up here. I will wait to see if anyone in the team is able to join us. Or you can raise your hand, I believe, is another function, which is along the bottom.
So you've got a raised hand there from Ian.
Okay. I'll promote Ed as well. Ed. There we go. You can just turn your cameras and microphones on and you'll join us up here. Hi, Ed.
Hey, so
hi, everyone.
good to see you, Ed. Maybe you'd like to give us a couple of words on the process so far from the DTR Medical point of view, while Ajith is finishing his preparations.
Yeah, of course. So our part of the journey so far is we started with, of course, our engineering department supporting them with the development process of the SNAP device. From there, we launched the product. We've sent out to date 95 boxes to ENT clinics in the UK for free. So we've really tried to help push the product into the market and push safe endoscopy. Since then we've had a few different clinics have continued to order with us. We're just looking to grow the product now, and hopefully we can answer any of your questions today or concerns that might help get more people to try it, really.
Thank you. Ian, would you like to add anything? Are you on camera? We put you on the spot and asked you to raise your hand, so if you want to turn on your camera, then you can join in the conversation. One question I had that might be for you guys at DTR, Ed, is about the CE marking. Ajith did mention it very briefly, but obviously with the changes in regulation as a result of Brexit, there's a move from CE marking to UK CA. So is that managed and compliance to that, is that managed at the DTR side, or is that all sorted and ready to go?
Yes, so the product is registered, and yeah, it's all managed by DTR. We got it all done our end, so we're all covered on that front. I know that Brexit's caused a combination of uncertainty, and regulatory side of things has opened up a can of worms that side as well. The MHRA has been registered as well in the last few weeks, so the product's all covered.
That's excellent news, and I think Ajith mentioned, didn't he, that there was a lot of well-meaning people trying to innovate during the early days of the COVID crisis, who didn't understand the regulatory process and the CE marking, and that became a bit of a frustration for people. But all those rules are in place for good reason. They're to keep people in hospitals safe, they're to keep staff safe, and they're to keep patients safe. So it's excellent that you've had the expertise to manage your way through that process.
Absolutely. So we always ensure that we adhere to the highest standards to make sure that we're protecting not just our NHS staff but our patients as well, because the whole point of DTR was it created to save lives, and that's what we endeavour to do.
Absolutely. So Ian, you've joined the conversation, the tea break conversation. Any burning thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Ed's sentiment there. Really, is that this product certainly gives us the chance to be able to assist the clinics to come back. We're constantly seeing in the news the sort of the patients that aren't getting through the clinics at the moment, the backlog of patients. So this product certainly gives the clinicians assistance in being able to tackle that backlog. I think it's, on the other side of it, if they're going to tackle the backlog, they've got to feel comfortable in being able to sort of feel safe in that environment, and certainly this product definitely offers them that. I've had a number of sort of feedback from customers who have said that they're actually using sort of a scissor technique in terms of snipping the mask. Well, we're trying to work with them in a positive way to actually guide them to what we feel is best practice for clinician, for patient, and overall outcome. So it's like most things, when there's change involved, it takes a bit of time, but I certainly feel we're not going to stop sort of moving forward with this until it's guaranteed sort of the right focus, and we will get there. But it's like I said, everything is part of change, and we will get there. But it's a good process to be in, certainly.
Absolutely, definitely a real a bit of a journey for everybody involved. Okay, so Ed, Ian, thank you very much. I'm sorry I put you on the spot there, but I had every confidence you'd be able to come up with some interesting additions to the presentation. Ajith has now turned his camera on, so I'm assuming that means he's ready and to come back into the room. So I think we can hand over back to. This is a bit like the Mars landing, isn't it? Trying to do commentary for this.
It's just as technical, to be fair.
Well, Ajith is going to be back over to you, okay?
So thanks very much. Thanks for bearing with us whilst we've got things set up. So what we've done is we've tried to create an environment that's similar to what you'd have in clinic. I've changed the layout so that it's easy for you to see, slightly different for me, because I'm just keen that you can see what I'm doing. So part of this is me kind of performing things blind, but hopefully it will just give you an idea of how easy it is to do things. So first thing, this is our patient. This also happens to be Chris as well. But our patient would be sat out in the waiting area wearing a face covering. This is what the healthcare practitioner would have, a normal face mask. And here we've just taken out the box so you can see the snap devices here. So what I'm going to do is just open it up. And normally I would do this on a table. Hopefully my hands aren't going to be all over the place. So if you can just see on the camera there, what I mentioned is you've got this white band at the top. So what I've tended to do now is actually place the outer part just underneath that white band. And as I said, I tend to favour using just one snap valve. So you can see the reason why we called it snap, because it just snaps into place there, and it's really as easy as that. And then here's your trocar. So in goes the trocar, a few turns, and by turning it, you're not just making the hole a bit wider, but you're also just clearing the material within the mask itself. So normally the process for us is that these are ready-made. Our healthcares fortunately just get a box of snaps. When they're free, they actually pre-prepare the masks for us and keep them in a box, so that essentially when the patient comes through into the clinic area, they say, can you remove your mask, put it in your pocket? They'll check the temperature, they'll ask them to clean their hands, and before they've come anywhere near the clinical room, then they've done that. So Simon, can you throw me the bottle? That's what is properly here. So here you go, Chris. Chris was just displaying his vaccination badge. Both of us have been very fortunate that we both had our jabs, so that certainly doesn't make us invincible, but it's a good step forward. So on it goes. And
really, I don't ask them to position it or anything. The patient just usually puts it on in any way that they feel is comfortable or appropriate. So they've now had their hands clean, they've had the temperature checked in our clinical environment, and they'd walk into the room like this, usually walk in talking because they're so desperate and so keen that they've physically seen a doctor face to face. It's amazing, because we thought they all existed on telephones. But no, we insist on seeing people face to face. It's bizarre. What I will do is I'll take the history from the patient, but I'm quite comfortable with talking to the patient. I'm not sat there now going, God, every single word that comes out of that person's mouth is just them spluttering across the room. I'm comfortable with the fact that if they cough or clear their throat, which we see some people who come in with coughing and throat clearing problems, that I'm not every time anxious about the fact that they're doing that on me, regardless of whether I've got an apron or an FFP3 mask or whatever it is. That's just going all around the room. So there's just something nice about keeping it in place. Then when it's time to do the examination, what I will do is position it. Now, most patients intuitively will put this in the middle, but I tend to like to scope through one side. I tend to favour the left nostril. So all I'll do is just place it just underneath the left nostril, and you can see I've just used the aluminium band to my advantage just to position things, and I'll just say, just make sure you don't touch the valve. So here's the endoscope. I just have to kind of probably say this, that I haven't chosen Stortz because they're any better than any of the others. It's truly because they gave it in a nice box that was safe and easy to transport. So I better say that as a disclaimer, as otherwise I'll be in trouble. The key thing at this point is lubrication. So avoiding getting any lubrication on the tip of the scope. I'm absolutely covering every element of this scope at the end in lubricant, but making sure you can see on the camera there that there's no lubricant on the tip. Okay, so the first step is, we call it thread, lift. So it's adjust, which is adjust the mask on, then thread, and then lift, and then scope. They're the procedures there. So when I'm threading the scope through, I'm not going to look at this screen. So all I'm going to do is just pass the scope through the valve. What's that? I don't think it's oh, I see. Okay, fine. Okay, so we thread through. Now, once you thread it through, the valve goes through, the scope goes through quite easily. And immediately at this point, you can just see where the direction of that nostril is. So it's almost so tempting just to pass it straight through. But in you go. There's very little resistance at all here to scoping through. So in we go, down to the back of the nose. So this is the eustachian tube, just on the side there, which goes up to the ears, into the postnasal space, and down we go through the nostril. There's the larynx, just say ee. There's Chris's vocal cords there, and then we can gently come out. So when you come out, as I said, the key thing is to make sure that your scope here is in a neutral position, that it's not hooked. And so as we're withdrawing, I'm keeping my finger, hopefully you can just see it here, I'm keeping my finger on the base of the valve as we're just coming out here, and just slowly withdrawing this out. And we'll just show you this bit, I'm sure Chris won't mind. We'll just show you this bit here as we're getting through the valve. But it really just slips out without problem. I mean, I could probably just do this without anything, but it comes out like that. It doesn't get stuck at all. You all right? So that's it. I'm sorry I can't make it any more exciting. But really, that's it. So, but I can genuinely understand, and what I'll do, let me just pre-wipe this, and this is our process, and I might as well go through this, that when the procedure's finished, you can see all the way through, the patient has maintained a mask on their nose and mouth. So if they did cough or sneeze, they're completely covered. What I then do is we use Tristel here to clean a scope. That's our protocol in clinic. And what we will do is pre-wipe the scope. And this is before any of our healthcares come into the room. So I just start at the top using the pre-wipe and just work my way down the scope all the way to the bottom. And then once we've pre-wiped it, then I can quite happily hand this scope out and get it clean. And so that's basically the process, and then I can finish the consultation, speak to the patient, whatever it is. At this point here, when I finish the consultation, I'll say, take your mask. They've got their mask. So this one now just gets disposed of in your gloves, and then I guess thrown out into the bin. So you can kind of see that our process in clinic isn't slowed down by using the snap at all. It just all kind of seems to flow. Everything makes sense. There's no point where I've taken a pair of scissors to Chris's face that he has to kind of be alarmed as to why I'm going to cut at his face. And I mean, all of the risks with that, I don't even want to think about. And also, more importantly, there's no point at all where during the Nasendoscopy, I've asked him to uncumber his nose or his mouth or anything like that. So that really, the purpose of that, I know it's quick, but I guess the purpose of it is to show that within a few minutes, I can perform a history and examination like we would do normally. He hasn't coughed or sneezed once at all, so there's no abnormal amount of aerosols in the room, etc. And we can carry on and see the next patient. So I will just go back to this, and should we just, is that fix that in? Let's get this, and then we can take any questions if I hold that there. Yeah, so has anyone got any questions?
So thank you very much for that, and I can assure you that compared to an awful lot of the seminars that we host and chair, that was actually genuinely exciting. There was live action procedures there.
I was desperately trying to think how I could make the Nasendoscopy exciting, but I'm afraid the beauty of it is that it's really not that exciting. It's amazing to think that people have made such a big thing about this process, and it's stopped. The worrying thing is that cancer services and cancer diagnostics have stopped as a result of patients not being protected and covered. But
no, that's
makes sense.
Very clearly the important and serious message is that you've managed to continue with those vitally important procedures as a result of quite a simple device, but you've been able to do that and stay compliant to all the health and safety regulations and product regulations. So, Isabel, I noticed we have another few questions. I noticed that they're either in the chat or in the Q&A, which is fine. We can read either. Is it?
Yes. Yeah, we've got a few questions about using it with a rigid scope.
Yeah.
And how that works.
So, yeah, no, it's easier with a rigid scope, to be honest with you, because one of the challenges is the resistance of the valve. Obviously, it's a valve, it has to offer some kind of resistance. For example, if we made it as to my original idea, which is just a silastic, as soon as you blow through it, it would just deflect the other way. Actually, Mark tested it originally with rigid scopes. That's the original design process. Mark didn't have a flexible scope to use. We could only use the flexible scope when it came to me, and I'd use it on the mannequin. So in the original process of making it, it was designed to accompany at least a 4mm diameter standard nasal endoscope. So no problem at all.
That's great. Is there any risk to damage the tip of the scope as it comes out of the device?
There is a risk. And if you don't adhere by the instructions, in particular the lubrication, and in particular the way in which you remove your scope, then there is a risk that your scope will get damaged. Scopes have been damaged way before any of this. Scopes get damaged by being inappropriately packed away in the box. Scopes get damaged by being dropped, etc., etc. Unfortunately, it's one of the things that happens to them. But if you take care of it and if you follow the instructions, it won't damage your scope at all. So the key thing is the lubrication, reducing the friction, and ensuring that the tip of the scope is straight when you withdraw it, and you're not just yanking the scope out, you're actually carefully pulling it out, and it will come out without a problem. But if you don't follow those, then there's a chance it can get damaged.
Great. Is water adequate for lubricant, we've been asked?
No.
What should we be using?
Not promoting any company, but water-based lubricant is fine, and that's what most places will use.
and I used that way before because it's more comfortable for the patient. The more lubricant you use, the easier it goes through. So obviously we want lots just to pass through the valve, but the truth of it is that the more lubrication is on the scope, the less friction there is, the much easier it is for the patient to tolerate. So not water alone. Prior to all of this, some people were just using water to pass the scope through, but that's not a sensible way of doing it through this.
And how quickly did it take you to adjust using the SNAP device and the new procedure till you felt comfortable?
Yeah, so that dot chart that I put up was my mechanism of learning. And the key thing with that is during those 30 endoscopies was actually the iterative design process as well. So not only was I learning a new technique, but I was learning a new technique on a new valve each time. And some of them certainly far from optimal to what we have now. So I would say on average 30. What amazed me was that our nurse practitioner, who now does our Nasendoscopy for our own risk scoping, kind of basically learned it in about 10 scopes. So it just demonstrates the difference in someone learning it from scratch, so they don't have to unlearn to relearn, versus someone who's just learning it, all the steps and processes from the very beginning. So, but for me, about 30 scopes, till I felt like I can do it, without even looking left to right, backwards, etc. I think the demonstration on the video that I showed with the other scopes, what you probably didn't see there was that I was looking at the camera so that you could see what I was doing, but I couldn't actually see anything that I was scoping. So hopefully you didn't notice that, but actually I was performing a lot of that blind. So it just goes to show that it's possible to get you back to the standard of scoping where you're at. I think it's not that much battery. But let me switch back to this camera. So I'll switch back onto the Mac. There we go.
Great, I think that's covered most of our questions. I've got one more, although I'm not quite sure. What other AGP can the SNAP be used for? I think you might have to expand on AGP for us.
Yeah, so I think so. AGP is aerosol generating procedure, and I think the next logical step is the use of this in transnasal esophagoscopy. The department that has significantly reduced the number of diagnostic procedures they performed is gastroenterology. So that's where the scope is passed through the mouth, down through the esophagus into the stomach. It's a similar kind of piece of equipment in that it's an endoscope, but it's much larger, broader diameter, certainly a much more unpleasant experience, I have to say, in having something put all the way down the throat. The key thing is that they have a channeled scope. So it's broader, and that allows them to do biopsies, dilatations, any procedures. But they also have suction. So now you do have air traveling over mucosa, which means you are generating an aerosol during that procedure. So it's a whole different process. So for gastroscopy through the mouth, obviously the SNAP is not the device that you would use. We certainly looked into the possibilities of creating something specifically for them. And I think if there was a demand for it, we'd certainly use our experience and create something along those lines. However, there is an alternative mechanism to go into the stomach through the nose. So in the same approach that we've talked about, but actually you just pass the camera further. So I stopped when I was scoping Chris at the top of the larynx at the voice box. But actually, if your scope was longer, which we do have some scopes like that, you can get the patient to swallow it, go into the esophagus and down into the stomach. And as long as that device doesn't have suction with it, there's no reason why you couldn't do that through a SNAP valve. So there's a lot of diagnostic esophagoscopies that can be performed. And in fact, I do that in clinic. I do diagnostic esophagoscopy through a SNAP device, and often get asked to do it because gastro don't want to perform an OGD because it's an aerosol generating risk. So we've had the gastroenterology department now visiting us in ENT, trying to see how we do it, and actually now wanting to adapt some of their diagnostic procedures. So not the interventional ones where they have to use the larger scope, but if they just purely want to have a look, we're actually going to team up now and do the approach through the nose using the SNAP valve. So I think that's what they mean. And I think one clinician is planning on doing a stretch through it by not going through the scope channel, but actually was going to put two valves in and put the camera up one and then put the dilator down the other, get the patient to swallow it and use it to stretch someone's esophagus, which is also technically possible as well to do. during that time. So these are different things that I think people have come up with ideas. We've had a few have tried it with operating, but it's slightly different in the operating environment because the instruments that you use might be a bit broader, and this was very much designed for a diagnostic scope and not necessarily to fit an instrument through. So.
If the patient coughs or sneezes during the procedure, would you take any extra precautions afterwards?
So the only extra precaution that we take if a patient coughs or sneezes is just increase the fallow time. So that what I tend to do actually is I run my clinics at the minute because we have no routine ENT going. So it's quite luxurious for me. I get all 6 clinic rooms to myself because everyone else is on the telephone. But right now I have one room where I can use for my sort of putting the records in the notes, and we have a dedicated endoscopy room, which is just a clinic room. So if the patient coughs or sneezes, we just increase the amount of fallow time, which is the settling time in the room, which is generally recommended for about 20 minutes. And the beauty of that is that you know that you still reduce the distribution of droplets, and I think it's droplets that really are the main concern as to what that contacts and touches. But we always have ventilation in our rooms. The windows are wide open. We don't have a ventilation system. We don't have any measurement of air exchange systems, air exchanges, number of air exchanges in the room. And the reason why we don't use those ventilation systems is because of the way our ventilation in our clinics work. They just pass from room to room. So it's a bit like in theatres with laminar flow, for example. It doesn't actually evacuate the whole area. All it does is pump air from one place into another. So ironically, in theatres, even though the staff in theatres are safe, and they're all wearing FFP3 masks, everyone in the corridor who thinks they're safe and don't need to wear a mask, actually breathing in all of the air from the laminar flow theatre that's being kicked out. So there's a lot of information that comes through that people seem to follow and seem to think it makes sense, but it actually doesn't. So we just follow common sense. We increase the fallow time and open the windows and ventilate well.
Great. Somebody's asked, can SNAP be used with 3mm rigid scope, and can it be used with plastic fibroscopes sheath?
The sheaths we've never tried with, and as far as I'm aware, the only people who were making sheaths were Medtronic. They seem to stop that, and I think the reason why is that I've shown you that the variability in the scopes, even though they all have the same size, they all vary in the conformity of the chip tip cameras. I think that the time of sheaths was when we used a lot of fiber scopes where there wasn't a camera built into the end of the scope. It was actually just a unit you clicked on at the end. And most of the scopes then were very similar in size, so you could use a universal sheath. But sheaths posed a similar problem in terms of the worry about damage. So if it fitted too tight, you could actually deglove your scope by pulling the sheath off. So I don't think there's many units who are using sheaths at all. We've not tested it, and in all honesty, we've got no intention of testing it because I don't think we know anyone who uses a sheath. I think maybe for some of the nasal esophagoscopies, some places might use that, but the diameter of those scopes might be too big to pass through a snap anyway. So sheaths we haven't tested with. And sorry, what was the other question? There was another one with that.
It was
3mm. Yeah, not bothering. So we designed the snap. Nase endoscope standard is 4mm width. The fattest scope I think that I've seen on the market is a Olympus VQ scope, which has got quite a sort of fat tip. That measures about 3.8mm with digital calipers. So that's the one that's caused us the most challenge, which we've adapted to with lubrication and the slight different technique in threading through the scope. But that's my scope that I use in clinic, and it's been absolutely fine. But 3mm, yeah, you'll have no problem at all.
Great. I think that sort of covers everything. We've got lots of great comments in the chat and a really engaging presentation, which has been fantastic. Thank you.
So I think there was a late question there about how many snaps do you use in clinic, Ajith. I assume that's about the amount that you use in a particular session rather than the amount that you've used overall. Is there any? I mean, I guess you use one per patient. I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, one per patient. I mean, they come in boxes of 40, and we run our clinics. So we have dedicated Nasendoscopy clinics. So we know our patient's going to be scoped when they're coming into the clinical environment. So at the minute, You know, I used to see 15 patients in a clinic. I've halved that now. A lot of that is actually not necessarily to do with clinic time, but our waiting areas, because I'm running clinics with other specialties. So if we have full clinic numbers, then our waiting areas are not going to be able to conform to the 2-meter distance. So that's actually what limits me with the number of people that I can see in clinic. It's to do with that. So 8 patients per clinic, which means 8 snaps, and I do 3 clinics a week.
Excellent. Thank you for answering that. Ajith, you've done a real job of work over the last couple of hours to introduce us to the product, to the procedure, to demonstrate. So thank you so much for that. It's definitely been one of the more interesting seminars that I've had to chair since lockdown. One of the more interesting ways to spend an afternoon when I'm actually in my back bedroom in my house, like most other people. So thank you very much for that. Are there any closing comments that you'd like to make before we draw the session to an end?
Well, I'd just like to say thanks to everyone again. Obviously, thanks to everyone in endoscope-i who, you know, we, particularly Chris and I, are very conscious that we talk a lot about our stuff, but actually we don't create it. We like to take the credit for it, but we really don't. So that's a lot of thanks to Simon and Mark. Particular thanks, of course, to Matt in particular from DTR, because very early on he engaged with us at the beginning of the process. Helped us, supported us along the way, and made sure that we created a product that was fit for purpose and safe, and continues to be there and thereabouts in the market. And of course, MediWales, because we won an award with MediWales, hosted by yourself. And thank you very much for hosting this event and giving us an opportunity to showcase what we've been doing over the last few months during this time. So, yeah, I think the time of COVID didn't necessarily need to be all doom and gloom. We've seen the challenge, and I think the message that we've got is that COVID should be a reason to do things better and not do things worse.
Absolutely. I think we're all going to be doing things a little differently, and there are going to be some benefits in terms of our workflow and the speed in which we can do new product development, and the close collaboration between clinicians and manufacturers to get stuff done, to get solutions out there. That's a real and you know, today's been a superb case study in exactly that. So yeah, the awards back in December seem like such a long time ago, and thank you for reminding us of that. MediWales is moving on now to its Connects conference, which is at the end of March, and again will be another opportunity to see numerous case study examples of clinicians working to innovate with manufacturers. So I notice Izzy has just put the Connects link in the chat, so please have a look at that if you're interested. Thank you to Neil for starting procedures today and introducing us to Innovia. Thank you to Ian and Ed for being put on the spot during the coffee break chat, and well done to you chaps. Ajith and your glamorous assistant Chris. Maybe Chris should be getting the biggest thanks for actually having the procedure done on him, just for the sake of
he was a bit conscious about his he was a bit conscious about his COVID haircut, but
oh, we all are.
He's just
yeah, more and more gel as the weeks go on. Izzy, well done for fielding all those questions, and thank you to everybody who's asked questions, and for those of us who've sat through today's presentation. Those of you who registered early will have had your free sample. Those of you who registered a little later, please either contact ourselves or the guys at DTR, and we'll make sure that a free sample goes out to you. I can confirm that during today's presentations, I was able to fit my free sample. I'm not asking Ajith to mark my work, because that's definitely the first time I've had any experience of working with Snap, and it seemed to be very intuitive and really easy to use. So I can confirm. If there's any questions to the speakers who or DTR that haven't been asked, or you'd like to ask them in private or after the event, then please contact ourselves, and we will make sure that you get your questions get put through to the right people. And I believe we're going to have the video of today available for people to watch at a later date, and so please again just contact us if you want to see that video. Otherwise, we will email all of the delegates with when that film is online and available to be viewed. So thank you again to everybody, and I think that brings everything to a close. So have a great afternoon.